Welcome to Disarming Leviathan, a podcast designed to equip you to missionally engage American Christian nationalists. For more info on today's guest and our suite of resources, visit disarmingleviathan.com.
So Chris, thanks for being with us. Your work, specifically in the book, Here Are Your Gods, has been really helpful for me and the congregation I serve in getting our heads around the biblical idea that's somewhat strange, I think, for most people today, of idolatry and the gods. So give us just a biblical overview of what's idolatry, what are the gods in the biblical context.
Thanks, Caleb. It's good to be with you. And hi, everybody. Yes, I think the main thing I would want to say is that we have gone a very long way from the biblical world, in which, not just in Israel, but in all the cultures of that era, there was a very close connection between the world of the divine, whether that was the God of Israel or all the gods of the nations, and the world of ordinary human life, politics, economics, and everything else. There wasn't this big separation that has injected itself into Western culture for a few hundred years, of a separation between the sort of so-called secular world and the reality. God was everywhere. God was in the marketplace, the throne room, the palace, the court, everywhere. And so the point is that for us, we think of gods as things that other people worship. Other religions have their gods and their idols. But in reality, in Israel, the problem was that they had now become a people within a surrounding culture, the Canaanite culture, in which, as they looked around them, they saw life going on pretty successfully for many of that culture. They'd got alphabets, they'd got business, they'd got fairly good way of living and so on. So as an average Israelite, although we might read the Old Testament and think, why on earth did these Israelites keep on straying away from the God, the living God, whom we think is our God, and going after these Baal gods? What was the point? Why did they do it? We sort of criticize them for it. And we forget that if you put yourself in the shoes of an Israelite, you say you would go on worshiping Yahweh because he's a great God. He's good in battle. He's going to make Israel great. He's our God. He's our national God. But we look around us and we see that for everyday life, Baal is actually the god of sex. He's the god of business. He's the god of deals, land deals. He's the god of fertility. So if you want your crops and your animals and your wife to have, to produce offspring, then you need to worship Baal. Follow the ways of the people around you. And I think that kind of syncretism, which is very much there in the Old Testament, is basically Western syncretism. We want to say we worship God, G-O-D, whatever that word means, God bless America. Well, what God are you talking about? Are you talking about the living God of Israel of the Old Testament, the Lord God, the Father of the Lord Jesus Christ, or just some generic God figure? So we have still the idea of we want to worship God, especially on Sundays, and we'll do all of that, but we'll worship God alongside what surrounds us, whether that's in our churches. So we'll have in many of our countries, including my own in Britain here, flags, national flags, regimental flags, as if somehow that's the God we have on our side, whoever is on the other people's side. So we tame God to be the God of our nation. Or we say, well, for the rest of the week, it's all very well on Sunday to worship the Bible, God. But the rest of the week, you look at, if you're going to do business, you just got to do business the way everybody else does. You got to do farming the way everybody else does. So you go after what effectively become idols. You give them allegiance. You work that way. You think that way. They affect your priorities. And they affect, indeed, your morality, because these other gods will always twist the truth. They lack any sort of integrity. They lack any kind of holiness and purity. So you can claim to be a follower of God, of Jesus, and yet effectively be living a life of idolatry. And that's the subtle thing. That's why it is so dangerous and so hidden, because we're so unaware of it. It just seems so plausible that God is for Sundays, and the rest of the life is you live it according to the standards of the people around you, which, of course, the Old Testament said, the gods of the people around you, i.e. Baal, whatever else it was.
So in the ancient mind, if I'm understanding right, people are walking around and there's like stones that are stacked up on a hillside. Sometimes you go into a city and there's statues of human-like figures, sometimes animal figures. In their understanding, did they think, oh, those stones are the god, or that statue is the god, or did they see that as a symbol of something else? And if so, what was it a symbol of?
Yeah. Well, the idea that somehow the Israelites looked at these statues and so on and thought they were the gods, or no, that the Israelites thought that the foreign nations imagined that they were the gods, is actually one of the ways in which, in our rather superiority complex, we think that the Israelites didn't really understand what idolatry is, that these foreign nations didn't think that the gods were in the stones. They thought that these stones or these statues were images of the gods who are up there in the heavens. Now, that to me is actually a very demeaning way of thinking of the people of Israel. They were far smarter than that. And if you read the prophet Isaiah, he has this marvelously satirical piece in Isaiah 46, where he says that Baal and Nebo are stooping down from heaven. Who were Baal and Nebo? They were the gods of Babylon. They were extremely powerful gods. They were the national gods. That was Babylonian nationalism, right? It was all embodied in Baal and Nebo. But they're stooping down. Why? Because their statues are being carried away on ox carts because Babylon is being conquered and destroyed. So who are these gods that are supposed to be up in heaven? If they can't even defend their own statues, let alone their own people, why are you worshipping them, Israel, is what the prophet is saying. Do you want a God that you have to carry around on a cart, or do you want a God who actually carries you? So they were aware that these gods were somewhere else, but that doesn't mean they were distant. They were involved. The temple was a powerful place where the statue of the god was. It represented, in a sense, the CEO's office. This is where the god rules from. This is the symbolic presence of the God who rules on this land, which was why it was so surprising that when Israel eventually built a temple for Yahweh, they didn't have a statue of the God because he was invisible. He's not in the temple. He is the God of heaven and earth. He's the God of all nations, all lands. Yeah.
So you mentioned that Babylon had a god, or the national god of Babylon. I've also heard that Rome in different eras would have this these practices of worshiping Roma, the god-ish version of their empire. Was that a common thing? Was it only empires? Did tribes do it? I mean, how common is that idea that there's a god of our people?
Well, I think that is a very common idea. I mean, I think anthropologists would say that is a feature of human life, and I suppose the Bible would say it has been ever since the fall, that we create gods out of our own identities, which, of course, again, is a very tribal thing to do. But tribalism isn't confined to Africa or anywhere else. We all have our tribes and the gods of our tribes, and you don't mess with the gods. So that's why in our, quotes, culture wars, there's such anger and vitriol and bitterness and violence, because if you've got gods, you're going to defend them because they're your. So that's one of the things that idolatry does, is it creates enormous division, divisiveness, and violence within human societies. They demand blood, which of course is where in Israel God says to us, I am the only God, and I will not give my glory to other gods. So worship the Lord and the Lord alone. But to come back to your earlier point, yes, it is a fact of human identities and tribes, but it is a particular temptation of empires. Because when human beings unite in a form of power, which is always a mixture of economic power, military power, and political power, often associated around a single person, like a Nebuchadnezzar or a Pharaoh in Egypt, for example, then inevitably the gods are there to enforce and to support the power, the king. And indeed, in many of those countries and cultures and empires, the king himself or the emperor would be either regarded as a god in his lifetime, or certainly when he's dead. I was in Egypt quite recently, and it's well known, that the pharaohs, when they died, joined the stars, became one of the gods. One of the great things about Ramesses II, who was a real megalomaniac, he built statues miles high of himself, and even there's a carving of himself offering worship to himself. I mean, it's incredible. Yeah, it's there
Wow.
in Abel symbol. You see him with his hat, bowing down and offering to him seated on the throne. Um, he claimed to be a god in his lifetime. He was deified. We know that Augustus Caesar initially was the son of God. He was the son of Julius. Well, he wasn't his literal son, but he was a nephew. But here is someone who is claiming to be the son of a god. But before very long, he and his successors are being regarded as divas themselves. They are deus, they are gods. And I think this tendency to the kind of blasphemous, narcissistic arrogance which demands a kind of allegiance and which excludes all other opposition is very much a feature of imperial power, which you see throughout the ages, ancient and modern. And one of the places where it's lampooned is the book of Ezekiel, where Ezekiel portrays the Pharaoh of Egypt as a great monster in the Nile, like a sort of great crocodile. But he says, "You boast," and what you say, Ezekiel puts words into the mouth. He says, the Pharaoh says, "The Nile, the river Nile, is mine. I made it for myself." He claims to be the source of the very life of his people, because the Nile was also divine, but the Nile is the god of Egypt, providing all the fertility, all the wealth, all the power. And the Pharaoh says, "I made it." And the prophet goes on to say, God's going to yank you out of that river and chop you up and make you food for the birds. So it's a pretty, as I said, it's almost like a horror movie. Some of Ezekiel's, it's a cartoon horror movie, but it's just trying to show that idolatry is phenomenally powerful
Hmm.
because it grabs the imagination, it grabs allegiance and loyalty. And allegiance and loyalty are good things when you're being loyal and allegiant to the right people or things, but they can become massively destructive when they then become nationalized and idolized and weaponized against others. And I think we see something of that in our contemporary world.
So if I'm a pharaoh or a Caesar or an emperor,
Mm.
it is in my interests to be connected to the God of our people or the gods of our people.
Yeah.
Because it gives to me a sense of authority. Uh,
Yeah.
I may not be able to reason everybody into agreeing with the decision I want to make, but this is God's decision. So,
Yeah.
you
Exactly.
know,
That's right. Oh,
you
absolutely.
people underneath me can't
Yeah.
disagree.
Yeah. I know. And that temptation is there at the lowliest level when ordinary people in ordinary churches will say something like, "The Lord told me this," You say, "Well, then I can't argue with you. I'm arguing with God." I mean, we
Yeah.
all know that that's a subtle temptation to simply attribute to God what's your own thinking. But when it emerges at a national level, and when human beings either claim to have or are assumed to have some sort of divine authority, I mean, that goes right back to the divine right of kings in the in Britain, which of course you there in the United States decided you didn't want to have any more of, and rebelled against Britain and got out of that kind of arrogant monarchical power, which was being exercised, and had been ever since Christendom, when the Roman Empire eventually, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire under Constantine, and then you end up with a kind of Constantinian Christendom mentality, in which Christians seem to come to this idea that the best way to save the world is to run the world. But of course, Christians are sinners also, and so when Christians get political power, they end up being corrupt and sinful like the rest of us, and that pride easily generates itself. The other thing to say about that, of course, is that when an emperor or a very powerful politician begins to talk in that kind of way or to claim divine powers, it exacerbates what is effectively the transactional nature of religion, other than the biblical faith and the biblical God. And that is that the whole reason for having gods is that it's a deal. The gods need humans because the god in the ancient myths, especially Babylonian and Egyptian myths, you feed the gods, you make statues to the gods, you paint them in gold, you build them temples because they need that. The gods need humans to serve them. But in return, you expect that the gods then will do something for you. The gods will give you fertility and everything else. So you end up with a form of religion which is fundamentally deal making, transactional. You get something from the gods get something from you. And that is, of course, what the Old Testament sets its face against. No, God is the God of the earth. He's not a God of deals. He's a God who loves. He's a God who gives. He's a God of grace. He's a God who forgives. And therefore your relationship with him is based on an authentic relationship of love, not a transactional relationship of who gets what out of what. By the way, that I think is what the book of Job is really hitting on, because you know what Satan says to God, the Satan in the sort of the opening chapter, when we're told that Job is the most righteous man you've ever known, fears God, etc., etc. And he's also very, very wealthy. He's got lots of camels, etc. And we are tempted to put the two together and fill the gap. Is, oh yeah, well, of course he's very wealthy because he's very righteous. That's prosperity gospel. And that's what the Satan comes up to God, because God says to the Satan, you know, where have you been? He said, well, I'm wandering around the earth. And God says, have you seen my servant Job, how righteous he is? And the Satan says, God, don't you know you're being fooled? Do you think God's serving you for nothing? He's only serving you because of what he gets out of it, because you're making him very wealthy. So God has to deal with that accusation because it's challenging the very integrity of God and Job, that this relationship is not honest, it doesn't have any integrity, it's a relationship of give and take. And the whole book of Job then is, in a sense, disentangling that, because God effectively says to the Satan, well, you know, if you think he's only in it for what he gets out of it, then take away everything that he gets out of it and see if he's still in it. And the book shows that Job preserves his integrity. But I think there's a great deal of that, even at a national level, in which, you know, we say, for example, God bless America, because we think if we give this, quote, God, whoever it is, everything that we think we should give him, we'll expect that he'll give it all back to us and make us all wonderful, great people. And that, I think, is a very, can I say it, dare I say it, a very pagan way of actually thinking about God in the first place. It isn't, it certainly isn't the biblical Christ-like cross-centered way of thinking of God in relation to us.
In my community, I often hear people say things like, if we can get the Bible back in schools, then God will bless us. If we can get a Christian leader in the office, then we will return to a good relationship with God. If my people who are called by my name, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that from Chronicles, yes.
Yeah.
Well, of course, that verse
will heal our land.
Yeah, but that verse includes repentance. Okay, it's not just. It's not
oh,
just.
Chris, now you're you know, now you're being specific.
Well, quite, because you know, you see, again, well, let me do two things. One is, let's go back to Jeroboam the first, because not Jeroboam. Well, I want both Jeroboams. Jeroboam the first was the one who pulled the northern tribes of Israel out of Judah and out from under Solomon and his sons' oppressive reign. He almost becomes a kind of Moses figure, Jeroboam the first. But he creates a division. But then what the text says is that he set up gods, idols, statues, in Dan and to the south in Bethel, and said to the others, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. You don't need to go to Jerusalem to worship Yahweh in the temple. No, here you are. And he creates a religion for his people. quite literally, the text says he appointed priests who were not of the line. He built temples, etc. So he's the first example, I think, in the Bible of what we might call Yahweh nationalism. He is using God to protect his own state. It's a kind of here's the religion I will create in order for my political purposes. That's Jeroboam the first. Now, when you come to Jeroboam the second, that's at the time of Amos, and it's a couple of centuries later. It's in the 8th century. And you remember that Amos goes to Bethel in the northern kingdom and starts proclaiming that they are oppressing the poor, that there's injustice, that there's corruption in the land, that the whole place is filled with all sorts of social evils, and so on. And the high priest of the temple comes and says to Amos, get out, you can't say those things here because, and he says, this is the king's sanctuary and the temple of the kingdom, not Yahweh's. The whole thing has become politicized that, Jeroboam II. Now, what we also know is that Jeroboam II, that the shrines were full, the worship was popular. There was a great deal of religion going on. But it's as if Amos is saying, God doesn't care what's happening in the shrines, in the temple. What God cares about, what is happening in the marketplace, in the gate, what is happening to the poor, what is happening to the landless, to the homeless, to the foreigners. And so this sense that you can have a religion, you can have a country with massively popular religion, but with a great deal of social evil going on at the same time. And that was the northern kingdom of Israel. And again, I don't know to what extent I'm allowed to be political on your broadcast, but I suppose, that's that's part of the turf. I remember arriving in the States one time, it's a good number of years ago now, because it was very soon, I think it was a day or two after President Bush had won the election, George W. Bush. And I was picked up at the airport by a very dear Christian friend who I respect and still love. And she's a wonderful lady. But she was rejoicing in this result of the election, and her words were, "We've got our man in the White House, because here at last we've got a Christian president." Now, I didn't say what I was thinking, and she said to me, "And he holds prayer meetings in the Oval Room."
Mm-hmm.
And I thought, oh, that's good. Of course that's good. I wasn't trying to be mean, but I was thinking to myself, actually, I rather think that God doesn't really care too much about what he's doing with those prayer meetings in the Oval. What God cares about, according to Amos, is what's happening on the streets, what's happening among the poor, what's happening in the country, in where the needy are, with the poor and the dispossessed, and so on. That, according to Amos, is where God, because if you think of Jeroboam II, religion was flourishing. God wasn't interested whether he was having even evangelistic camp meetings in the palace in Jerusalem. What God was concerned about what was happening in the public square, what was happening in society. And I think that sense in which we can live with a kind of belief that somehow if we just get Christians into these public places, that all will be well, goes back to that kind of transactional mindset to some degree, which of course can be a little bit polluted or complicated by the fact that God does say to Israel, look, if you will live the way I want you to, if you will obey me, then you will experience God's blessing, which of course easily translates into a kind of prosperity gospel. But the blessing of God's prosperity is for those who will obey him, who will live according to his standards. Not just those who say, well, we believe in God, got the Bible in a school or something. It's a much more profound need, I think, in a society than that.
Yeah. And the desire to have our person in office sounds very tribalistic. As long as the person says the right words, wears the right iconography on their necklace, attends the right house of worship, I feel good because they're on my team. What I hear you saying is, yeah, but are they being like Jesus? Are the prisoners being visited? Are the poor being cared for? Are the hungry being fed?
Yes.
That we look to the fruit of the person's actions, leadership, whatever, to see is this good or not good. Jesus striking, saying, if you want to know if a leader's doing God stuff, look at the fruit of the
Yes.
leader. And even I'm continually over the last few years drawn to Galatians and the contrasting lists of the fruit of the Spirit and the works of the flesh, and even
Yeah.
trying to discern not just a person, but is a movement of the
Yeah.
Spirit of God or of the Spirit of the age.
Yes, I think that's a good way of putting it, and I would completely agree with you. I mean, it's not to suggest that a political leader, because they're a Christian, is not going to be flawed, okay? Because we are
Right.
all flawed and we will all have mistakes. And it doesn't necessarily mean because you're a Christian, you will have the right and the best political policies, because
Right.
you can be a Christian and be misled, or have
Sure.
ideas which are not necessarily the best politically and economically. Equally, I would want to say you can have a leader in Parliament, whether a prime minister or a president or whatever it is, who may be an atheist, and not believe in God at all, but by God's common grace, believing what I do, they can be a person of integrity. They can be a person with high standards. They can be a person with political and economic aims which are concerned for the poor and the needy, concerned for issues of justice, concerned for society, and may well adopt policies which would be more pleasing to God than some policies that a Christian might adopt. So we need to sort of disassociate this idea that somehow Christians have got a monopoly
Yeah,
on good politics,
that's right.
because that simply isn't true. I think, in terms of an understanding of God and the public marketplace, God's and see, Paul can speak even of Roman magistrates as diakonoi theou, servants of God. He
Yeah.
can expect Roman magistrates ought to be doing justice, and punishing those who are wicked and relieving those who are wrong. And when you look at the book of Proverbs, what it says about the king, for example, is a great deal about the king. And for the word king, we shouldn't just think of, king literally, but of the government, because the king in the ancient world was the government. They embodied the power. And the king is to care for the poor. The king is to make sure that justice, the king is to protect the economy, make sure that weights and measures are honest, and so on. So there's a great deal of responsibility on government in the Bible. And I think it doesn't just mean government in Israel or Christian governors, because there weren't any Christian governors for centuries, even after Jesus.
That's right.
But God is interested in government. God is passionately concerned about the integrity of politics. And that's why, speaking personally, I think that so many Christians, perhaps particularly evangelical Christians, we've suffered, especially since the early years of the 20th century, with a kind of evangelicalism which wanted to opt out of the public space for quite a long time. And then we've sort of jumped back in, but we've jumped back in with the clock turned back to the Christendom era, in which, again, we think that
Right.
the best thing to do is not to seek to do justice, but just to get our tribe in power. And that, I think, is a wrong road to be on.
Yeah. So, Chris, you've helped us think about how the biblical authors understand the gods and idolatry. We've touched on how that impacts us today, but maybe as we just kind of conclude our time together, how would you advise or coach us as we are thinking about political idolatry today? What are ways that we can recognize it? How can we keep ourselves from giving into it? Give us maybe some wisdom
Well,
in that
yeah.
space.
Well, thank you. I mean, interestingly, the Bible does warn us against particularly the idolatry of mammon, of greed, of money. And I think it always was and still is, one of the fastest routes to idolatry, is
Mhm.
that for some, in my mind, curious reason, people who make vast amounts of wealth are somehow assumed to be particularly clever. Even if they were smart in the way they did it, but it doesn't necessarily give them expertise in every other area of life. And I'm not only thinking of, contemporary billionaires and almost trillionaires in the world, but even Christians who, by God's grace, maybe produce books which sold in the millions and then made loads of money and become very, very wealthy as Christian celebrities. again, are somehow put on pedestals as having, we need to consult them. We need to hear from that person because they've made so much money. So I think money is one way in which idolatry is recognized. And I do think the Bible shows that clearly. And also you come right through to the book of Revelation, and you see there in Revelation 13, and I'm thinking of your own book here also, Caleb, how the cartoon imagery of beasts from the sea, is used to describe both enormous political and deceptive power of words and blasphemy and everybody bowing down to the first beast, and then also the power of economic control of phenomenal wealth, which then governs and crushes other things, and how these become mutually reinforcing. I think there's a great deal of subtle insight in Revelation 13 about this nexus of power between the political and the economic power in collusion, which then deceives people who, basically worship the beast, which sounds awful, but it's basically we all give allegiance to what we think will give us success. So I think the Bible does expose that. And as Jesus said, you can't serve God and mammon, but an awful lot of Christians think they can. And when you end up serving one, you really lose touch with the other. I suppose another way to spot what is the nature of idolatry in our society would be to look at the attitudes of people when they defend what they believe. I mean, I think, as you say in your book, it is really, really disturbing when people who claim to be Christian can use language, especially in the social media world, which is evil, which is not just unkind and unfair, but quite happy to pass on lies and then say, "Oh well, I didn't know it was a lie at the time." Well, you should have checked. I mean, there's a willingness to participate, to have a collusion in deception and conspiracy theories and all this stuff, which again I find frankly demonic, because the Bible tells us that the devil is the father of lies. And we live now in a world where social media simply amplifies lying to an incredible volume. It's almost unbelievable, which is, by the way, one reason why I'm not on social media personally. The only one I use is WhatsApp, because we have that as a family thing and we communicate through that. But I came off Facebook, Instagram, everything else, because there seems to me to be so much harm and evil in those spaces these days. I just don't want to be part of that at all. Anyway, that's a few thoughts, rather random.
That's good. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being with us. Where can people find you and your work?
Well, having just said what I said, I was persuaded to have a website.
There you go. That's different than social media.
Well, exactly, and it's not a blog. I don't have wonderful thoughts every morning to share with the world. It's just it's ChristopherJHWright.com, because that's the name I use in all my books, because it's my full name. And there are other Chris Wrights out there, and some of them are very fine people and write books. And our tax authorities in Britain once confused me and another Chris Wright and accused me of not sending in correct royalty records. So ever since then, I've used my full ChristopherJHWright.com. And that's simply got all my books, a whole load of the sermons I've preached, and some articles and lectures and that kind of thing. And I do a podcast curated by the Langham Partnership, because that's who I work for. You can find Langham just at langham.org, O-R-G. And I have a podcast called On Mission with Chris Wright, which is a bit wrong, really, because it's not me on mission. It's me talking to people who are on mission. But it's people who are from all over the non-Western world, and the majority world: Africa, Asia, Latin America, Pacific, Caribbean. It's just trying to introduce people to other ways of thinking. And so that's On Mission with Chris Wright through langham.org, and all my books are on my website, ChristopherJHWright.com.
Wonderful. Well, Chris, thank you so much for being with us, and thanks for your continued ministry and work.
Thank you, Caleb. Great to talk. Thanks, then.